Welcome to the NCO Journal Podcast, where we explore NCO professional development. This is a podcast series where we discuss published articles with authors and provide a forum for the open exchange of ideas, information, and solutions. I'm your host, Chago Zapata, managing editor of the NCO Journal at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Today we discuss the article Surviving the March, Lessons Learned from the 101st Airborne Division, with Lieutenant Colonel David DeGroot from the Army Heat Center at Fort Benning, Georgia. With us is Sergeant First Class Osvaldo Equite, NCOSE of the NCO Journal, and Senior Editor Tony Mena. Thank you all for being here. Before we kick things off, though, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so by training, I'm a physiologist. So in Army terms, I'm a 71 Bravo. That's physiology and biochemistry. So we're lab science officers. But my expertise and background is in heat stress physiology and how operating in heat stress can affect health and performance. And that's kind of what I've been doing over the course of my career for the Army, is all things heat, and also to a lesser extent, cold stress related. Do have some background there as well. But yeah, and actually a pleasure to be talking with the NCO Journal, because I'm prior enlisted. Once upon a time, I was an NCO.
Hey, all right,
Mustang.
Yeah. So it's a pleasure to be talking with this audience.
Well, thanks again for being here and for taking the time to talk a little bit deeper, to dive a little bit deeper into your article. I think it's important, and we did have some comments and stuff from the audience that I think that'll come into play in our discussion here. Let's go ahead and kick things off. Why is it that? Well, I know that also that two of your co-authors weren't able to come. Could you tell us a little bit about them and maybe why they're not here?
I certainly can. So, and I think it's important for the audience to recognize the different perspectives. So I'm coming to you as the director of the Army Heat Center. So I sit down here at Fort Benning, Georgia. And so I was the third author on the article. Lieutenant Colonel Amy Thompson is a physician. She recently just completed a tour as the division surgeon for 101st Airborne Division. And then Major Martinez is another healthcare provider who works within the division surgeon cell, and he actually headed up the initial investigation, or commander's inquiry, I suppose it was, to the mass casualty incident that occurred in June of last year at Fort Campbell that really got our interest in this. Both of them are in the midst of, of course, it's PCS season. They're in the midst of PCS moves, so I imagine that's why they're unavailable.
What was the reason for writing this article?
We collectively, I'm talking about officers in the medical command, AMED officers. We don't always do such a good job of reaching what's the target audience. Who do we really need to know and understand this information? It's not necessarily yes, we do want your brigade surgeons, your battalion surgeons, and their associated staff to know this stuff. But the day-to-day, boots on the ground, who's running these events? It's the NCOs. They need to know this information as well. And that's why when credit goes to Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, she was the one who had the idea. She contacted me, I think it was last December, of, hey, Colonel DeGroot, we should write this stuff up. We need to send this to a professional journal. And that's what kicked off our discussion, because that's who we need to know this information. It's not so much the healthcare providers. Yes, there are aspects of this they absolutely need to know, and they need to be part of the pre-planning for part of these events, utilizing, for whether it's a battalion, brigade, division, whatever level, they're the medical advisors they have. We need the NCOs who are actually running and supervising the events to know this information.
Your article, you share a lot of good information, things that are important for NCOs to know. But what kind of resistance did you face in the past when you suggested, units implement these different kinds of heat injury prevention practices? I mean, did you ever run across some instances of units kind of digging in their heels and not wanting to do some of these things?
I wouldn't say so much digging in your heels, but there have been one recent instance comes to mind In the interest of anonymity, I won't call out the specific unit or commander, of course, but just as an example, and we talk about this in the article, that on certain days, uh, under harsher environmental conditions, like we understand, like the events that we describe in our article of heat casualties during EIB testing. The brigade that conducted their testing, they're constrained by the annual training calendar, where they've got their, the annual training cycle and training center rotations and block leave and all that stuff, right? So sometimes it's just the unfortunate reality that the window of time where they have available to conduct EIB testing falls in the summer months. So we don't want to harshly criticize them for that, because we understand there could be circumstances there. But when you do make that decision, there's something that needs to be kept in mind. And this is where I've talked with some senior leaders at some various schools here at Fort Benning. And so I carry over some of my experience out and just outside my Army life. I'm a weightlifting coach, the sport of Olympic weightlifting. I do some coaching there. And one of the lessons I've learned, and I've heard from other coaches, is the answer to the question, what is the most important training day? And the answer is always tomorrow. The lesson there is, if what you do today impairs your ability to train tomorrow, today's training wasn't good. And the same goes for Army training. Whether we'll extend this up to Fort Campbell. If you're at Air Assault School and you get injured on day 3, well, your training's over. That was a bad training day. And sometimes the mindset needs to be, check the box. That isn't easily accepted, and that's where we get some resistance from leaders. But sometimes what you need to do is treat the event like, say, whether, we'll stick with the foot marching example of a 12-mile ruck march. Your single goal should be to meet the standard, finish it in under 3 hours. If it's a hot and humid day, if you've been a little bit under the weather with some illness, whatever the case may be, that's not the day to go out there and try and set a personal best in the time, to try and impress others, or just to prove yourself. You prove yourself by meeting the standard. And sometimes that message is one that isn't readily accepted by some commanders, because they want to see what people are, quote, made of and what they can do. But the reality is, to earn a given badge or tab, or even just to complete initial entry training like we have here at Fort Benning, sometimes what just needs to happen, if the weather conditions are poor, is meet the standard. So that's where I've gotten some resistance. Occasionally, that'll get the occasional commander will give me an eye roll. And, oh, really? Is that your guidance? But, sometimes there's not much else left you can do. Because motivation is a big risk factor. And sometimes we have to learn to keep our motivation in check a little bit.
Just going back to your article, I don't know if you took a look at it after we published it, but we did make a change, a significant change. Is we put one of the vignettes that you guys listed. I think there were 3 of them, and we put one of them, and we brought it up to the top to kind of showcase, what happened with, like, the most serious one, the one that Brigade Expert Infantry badge. So anyway, we moved it up because we thought it was if we wanted to put an attention getter up there at the top, to kind of give, to bring to life everything that you're talking about before you even bring it in, or before you even talk about it. So we do that on occasion whenever we have an article, and especially with an audience like ours, where they don't have a lot of time, and we want to grab their attention so that we can get them to kind of go down and read the rest of the article. But the thing is that brought that to life to me is that the number of heat casualties that were suffered by that unit, and that's pretty significant. I think you called it a mass casualty event. Would I be correct in that specific instance, that vignette that you guys discussed?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely. We don't have what's a textbook definition of mass casualty, but anytime when you have a number of casualties that overwhelms the locally available medical assets, and you've got to call in outside help, you've got a mass casualty situation, and that's what that was.
Well, what brought brought it home to me more than anything, because I served in the military myself for 20 years, and I don't remember ever getting a class on the different things to look for. Maybe a few things here and there, but it was more casually mentioned rather than specifically emphasized. And it's one of the things that I think that NCOs need to be aware of this, so that they can be informed and pass that information on to their soldiers. The thing that got me was where they were pouring ice water over their heads instead of dipping their arms into it. That was such a significant thing, that had the NCOs or had the information been passed on to the individuals, they would have been more aware, maybe not been dumping water and ice over their heads, and it would have been more effective. And that's what struck home to me more than anything.
Yeah, and on that point, that's part of what, zooming out a little bit from this particular incident, what we do with the program I run with the Army Heat Center is a big piece of that is prevention through training and education. Right now, of course, because I'm located at Fort Benning, and it's primarily the initial entry training population with the 3 basic training brigades that we have here, in addition to the infantry and armor basic officer leadership courses, is we train the drill sergeants on, as part of their onboarding process. There's a they call it a drill sergeant check ride. It's basically a Fort Benning run program to ensure that the drill sergeants, when they hit the trail here, so to speak, they are fully aware of local resources, policies, procedures, but also local challenges. And with that in mind, that's where we have an opportunity to provide them with a class on the prevention, but then also the recognition and appropriate response to a suspected heat casualty. Because we need them to know that. We're also working sometime later this fall. I hope to be getting up to Fort Jackson and meeting with the commandant of the Drill Sergeant Academy. That really, we'd like to see this added to the curriculum there, so that not just Fort Benning's drill sergeants, but drill sergeants across the Army receive this information. Because it's not just a problem unique to Fort Benning, as this incident at Fort Campbell shows.
I'm kind of jumping the gun here with we had some comments from our Facebook audience. They talked about training at NTC, JRC, the Mojave Desert, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So why do they need that? So it wasn't a question, it was more of a statement. Well, why do we need to know this stuff? Are you just trying to check a box or something with this? It just seemed like the individuals didn't seem to really get it as to what the significance of this article was, and that was when training in a humid environment. Whereas the places that he mentioned, or him and another person mentioned, were all warm, or not warm, but like desert environments. So can you tell us
more of a hot, dry?
Exactly. Can you tell us a little bit about the difference and what, like, training in one environment as compared to a dry environment, right, as compared to a humid environment? Can you tell us about the different kinds of training when it comes to that?
There's a little bit, with respect to that particular person's comment on Facebook, and now I want to go back and look and find you guys on Facebook to go look at the comments myself. But there's a little bit of an apples to oranges comparison here for 2 reasons, actually. It's not just the environment. I'll return to that in a moment. But what we know is that across the entire Army, about 70 to 80% of all heat casualties actually occur in TRADOC, not in FORSCOM units. It comes in all of our training formations. So that's where we focus a lot of our efforts. Because what are we doing in these across TRADOC units? It's either initial entry training and with turning civilians into soldiers, or it's various schoolhouses that are needed for either for professional advancement, whether it's the various NCOES schools, or to earn a badge or tab, which can be very much career enhancing. So there's always going to be some greater levels of motivation of people pushing themselves a little bit harder. That's kind of inherent to TRADOC that you may not necessarily have in a FORSCOM unit. So you have that difference just between the different unit types. But then to come back to your question with the weather conditions, the challenge for us when it's hot out, the primary way, depending on how hot it is, it may be the only way that we cool off is through the evaporation of sweat. In a very dry climate, like with the reader's comment about NTC or in Iraq, where it's very dry, sweat can freely evaporate just because of the very low humidity. So physiologically, our bodies do a better job of staying cooler in a hot, dry environment. You come to a place like, well, certainly here at Fort Benning, but also even up at Fort Campbell or anywhere else, JRTC at Fort Polk is another good example, where the humidity is that much higher. And then that's a barrier, an impediment to the free evaporation of sweat. And if we can't evaporate the sweat, we can't cool off. So that imposes, doesn't impose an additional strain, just our body temperature will then continue to rise as long as activity continues in those hot and humid environments.
Yeah, and I believe the goal here is to prevent heat injuries, right? Is to prevent overwhelming resources and things like that for the medical personnel that are conducting these training events. But this is just, the way I took this article was that you're trying to provide NCOs who are on the ground conducting the training additional information, additional tools that they can use to ensure that they prevent heat casualties. And to the other poster's comment is, training doesn't necessarily have to happen on that 12-mile road march, right? Like training happens way before then. It happens on Thursday ruck marches when you're doing a mile and a half, 2 miles out, 2 miles back. When you're doing ruck runs, when you're building up for those bigger events. So I think the information that you provide here is going to be helpful for those NCOs that are conducting training, throughout the year in every kinds of environments in different areas.
Yeah, no, thank you for that comment, Sergeant. And, I agree with you. Prevention, is the most important thing. The various efforts I lead here at the Army Heat Center, the foundation of all of that is prevention. And like you said, you make a great point. It's not just during that 12-mile ruck when you're trying to pass that final event to earn, I don't care, it's EIB, EFMB, aerosol, whatever reason you're doing that timed event to meet a standard. It's all of the preparation that comes to that as well. It's all of those training events setting yourself up for success. And prevention extends across all of those events. It's every day. Here at Fort Benning, the heat casualties we see, sure, a significant number of them occurred during those timed events. But they also occurred during just routine training, routine foot marches and run events. So it certainly should be throughout all of those that we need to be focusing on the prevention of casualties in the first place, so that when the time comes for that capstone event for whatever purpose, they are adequately prepared.
I really enjoyed your article, and I guess to touch on the Iraq and sweating and everything too, because I was in Iraq in 05, 06. I was a recon corpsman, and I feel like I didn't even know about heat casualty stuff until I went through the 18 Delta course when I was becoming a recon corpsman, and then I was a lot more empowered. But so your article touches on the training, but for combat, I feel like it's the same. You're still looking for symptoms. An empowered NCO looking out for their troops, and Iraq maybe is a drier heat, but you're wearing full-length uniforms and flight suits back then. You got all that gear on. You can't just take it off. You're patrolling for miles and miles and miles, and I feel like heat is sort of like the 12th man. It's like something that you can't always see on paper, but it's always there. So yeah, I just really enjoyed your article. I thought it was very empowering. I thought the signs and symptoms to look for NCOs, not even NCOs, all the way down to the private, everyone involved in the ruck. Like if you have a heat casualty, oh man, that takes away medical personnel. If you're on a mission, that's going to totally destroy your timelines and everything else. I mean, because that's a casualty. It may not be a gunshot wound, but it's a legit casualty. So your article definitely hit home.
Yeah, I appreciate your comments and thanks for that. I just want to put a kind of an exclamation point on some of that stuff in terms of they are a casualty, especially with heat stroke. And that, of course, that is the most severe of the category of heat illnesses is heat stroke. And make no mistake, it can be fatal. And that's why the recognition and response is so critical. And we make this point in the paper, the most important thing for a suspected heat stroke casualty is get them cooled off and making sure people know what's a good method, what are good methods. There's no one best. Well, there may be one best, but there's a number of acceptable methods to get someone who is, if you suspect heat stroke, to get them cooled off, because that can truly be a life-saving intervention. So they absolutely are a casualty who take medical resource, can be a drain on medical resources. And as you point out, can be just as impactful on the ability to conduct the mission as a gunshot or IED casualty. Still going to be a drain on medical resources and impact unit readiness.
The other thing I liked about your article is it educated everyone. So from personal experience, like I have been a heat casualty before, and I was the medical personnel. So the first time was in recon training, and it was very hot and cramped up. I think I passed out at one point, woke up at the collection point. Well, the second time, I think I was on a range. We were getting ready for Iraq, and this was Okinawa, and the heat, the humidity is just like a hot blanket you can never get rid of. Anyway, I was the one that was the heat casualty again on that time, and I was the only medical personnel. But all my Marines were trained, which is the importance of not just medical personnel knowing the signs and symptoms and treatment procedures for heat casualties, which is, again, why I loved your article. I think it speaks to the whole force.
To that point also it's not just the NCOs, one of the things I talked to the drill sergeants here at Fort Benning about is rely on all the other soldiers too. There are numerous instances we've had here where the first recognition that someone was struggling and getting in trouble was their battle buddy, who then spoke up. Hey, drill sergeant, Private Snuffy over here is looking pretty rough. Gets the drill sergeants, just like your non-drill sergeant NCOs, you can't be everywhere at once. You can't have eyes on everybody and monitoring everything. It's a team approach, and it comes back to that old standby phrase of know your soldiers, but also know your battle buddies, and recognizing when someone might be in trouble. And there's no harm in, hey, let's get a medic over here. If we're talking a force comm unit and you've got all the medical assets that we don't necessarily have in TRADOC, there's no harm in, hey, Doc, can you come check on Private Snuffy? And maybe it's nothing. And maybe it's something, and maybe you just intervened and made a very important intervention in taking care of a fellow soldier.
I wanted to talk a little bit about Tony and his situation there. He was a heat casualty, but from your experience, sir, what kind of, if somebody is a heat casualty, how does that affect the rest of their lives? And because I heard over the course of the years that your body temperature isn't as well controlled, or your body doesn't control your temperature as well once you've been a heat casualty. Well, can you go a little bit into that so the audience knows what can happen if somebody does suffer that kind of?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to, and that's a really great question. I'm glad you asked it, because our knowledge of the consequences, and really we're talking about heat stroke here. Let's remember, heat exhaustion is mild. It's transient. It's really a cardiovascular insufficiency. By that, what I mean, when we're exercising in the heat, go outside on a day like today, it's nice and hot out, and even just to go for like a 3-mile run. During that event, we've got a demand for a lot of blood flow to our working muscles. And we've also got a lot of demand to blood flow to our skin, because our skin is our body's radiator. That's how we transfer heat away from the core and help stay cool. In heat exhaustion, simply put, there's not enough blood flow available to both of your skin and muscle, and you can't continue. But as soon as you stop and cool off, it's over. There's no damage, there's no medical consequences to a heat exhaustion event. So when I talk about long-term possibility of long-term consequences, we're really talking about heat stroke. And that has that central nervous system dysfunction. There's often unconsciousness. They may have seizures. Can be quite serious. That's what can be fatal if untreated. Our knowledge of the long-term consequences of heat stroke is evolving. We've all heard it before of, oh yeah, if you had a prior heat illness, you're at risk in the future. And I don't believe that that's necessarily true. And here's why. We've gotten so much better at treating our heat casualties. I think it is true that if you've got, take the circumstance of a heat wave, and you've got an elderly individual in an apartment and they lose their air conditioning because of a blackout, because of power demands, and it overheats, and they have what we call classic heat stroke, not exertional heat stroke. And they're very hot for a long period of time. Is their body damaged by that event? Probably yes. In an exertional heat stroke, if they're not promptly cooled off and they're very hot for a prolonged period of time, may there be damage? Possibly yes. But we've gotten so good at recognizing and responding to a suspected heat casualty and getting them cooled off quickly that they're not hot enough, long enough to cause long-term damage. And so for an individual who's had a heat stroke, they may never have any long-term effects from it. It depends on how well they were taken care of at the time of collapse, is how my thought process has kind of evolved on that as we've learned more about the treatment. I don't have, I'm a scientist by training. I don't have good scientific data that backs that up. But just from my anecdotal experience of the heat casualties we've seen here at Fort Benning, that's what we're seeing. I had the opportunity to meet a lieutenant about a year ago. A year before that, so a little over 2 years ago now, he himself was a heat stroke during Ibolic. And he was treated promptly and appropriately. And when I saw him a year later, he introduced himself to me and reminded me of who he was. And he talked about in the year since his heat stroke, he recovered from it. He recycled into Ibolic and graduated. He went to Ranger school in the winter months, earned his Ranger tab, and he was out here at Fort Benning as a platoon leader, doing just fine. There's no reason to think that he's going to have any long-term consequences from his heat stroke event. I can't necessarily say that about someone who wasn't cooled off promptly and appropriately. And that's really where the difference comes. So for Tony, for your incident, I without knowing details and, how hot you were and whether there was central nervous system dysfunction, it's really difficult to say. Is that going to have some long-term effects for you? Or was it a singular event that you've recovered from and you get on with life?
I think I've recovered. I'm outside of the heat a lot now. But it kind of took a while. So oddly, there was the first incident, then there was the second incident. There wasn't much in Iraq, but we were very careful with everybody. But for years after that, I would cramp up very easily. So I don't know if that's a lingering effect. And it wasn't until this last year maybe where I feel like I'm totally fine now. But there was a diet change and everything. So, there's so many factors. But yeah, I think I'm recovered now. And really the hyper cramping was like the only lingering effect for a couple years.
Yeah, and that might have been, and it's probably pretty challenging to tell this far, looking in the mirror that far back.
Yeah.
If you had some rhabdomyolysis at the same time, some skeletal muscle damage there, and that's not uncommon. I'd say close to half of our, well, maybe not quite half, maybe a third of our heat casualties also have rhabdo. And so there may be some level of some muscle dysfunction, and that could have been where the cramping comes from. That's a little speculative on my part. So it's not necessarily the heat, it's the other things that happen to you at the same time, possibly.
Yeah.
So, and like you said, there's other things that, other changes in your life. You talk about diet stuff and whatnot. So, we want to be careful. I don't want to armchair things too much from a distance here.
That goes back to part of your article that I found interesting as well, was the individual responsibility and different risk factors to that. Can you talk a little bit more about some of that soldier individual responsibility a soldier has? And I'll give you one example. If a soldier doesn't eat before going out on a patrol, if they are not eating the entire MRE and things like that, that's when those calories get used up quicker. But can you talk a little bit more about what you meant in individual responsibility and risk factors?
Yeah, so there's a couple areas that relates to, and I mentioned to that earlier, just about that motivation. During say a timed foot march event, where having an understanding that, yeah, today it's, the sun's not even up yet and it's heat category 2. I shouldn't be going out there trying to set a personal record pace. I should be setting out there to meet the standard, absolutely, but just keeping my own motivation in check. But there's more to it than just that. There's that individual responsibility to maintain your fitness, to you just mentioned it in terms of appropriate fueling and hydration strategies. The other thing that we see here, and this is just part of it's almost part of our culture, the whole idea of suck it up and drive on. Well, there comes a time where that's no longer the right thing to do, and what you need to do is seek medical aid. And I'll give you an example. Now, this is a fairly serious one from a couple of years ago, but I think it's indicative of it. We had a private first class in basic training, and he got blisters on his heels. Now, I learned all of this in retrospect when I interviewed him in the hospital. He had blisters on both feet, on the heels of both feet. He's barely a month into basic training. Still getting used to wearing boots and walking everywhere. And then the blisters got worse. And then they got a little bit worse. He still didn't go over the sick call, or even just to see any other providers that might be available. Because what does a basic trainee do? He wants to stay in training. No one wants to risk, no offense to drill sergeants, but no one wants to stay with them any longer than they have to. You want to get at complete training and get onto your unit. That's why you join the Army. So he doesn't say anything. Then it gets infected. He doesn't say anything. It turns into cellulitis. Doesn't say anything. Then it's time for a longer foot march. Here's the thing, that cellulitis is already an immune challenge. He's having an immune response to an infection, which itself can cause a fever. And an existing fever can lower your threshold, increase your risk of becoming a heat casualty. And sure enough, he had a heat stroke. Now, how might that story have been different if a week earlier he went and just the sick call for the simple, hey, I got these blisters that are really bothering me, and gotten some attention to take care of those before they became infected? How might his story have differed? I can't guarantee you he would not have become a heat stroke, but there's a pretty good chance that contributed considerably to that circumstance. So you need to take care of yourself too. That's where that individual responsibility comes. Yeah, I need to take care of myself, and sometimes taking care of yourself means I need to get some medical aid, even if it's just going to sick call and just taking care of that routine stuff. So it's not just in the moment. It's not just the eating and hydration and pacing yourself, staying within your own limits that all matter, but also with medical risk factors. I could tell you several other anecdotes of instances like that, but I think that's a good one as an example of where the individual, we want to be careful not to blame the victim in this case, but there is some element of individual responsibility that contributed to the ultimate outcome here. Now, we're happy to say that this individual recovered fine, was reinsert, cycle insert, completed basic training, and last I knew is he's happily serving somewhere. But all of that didn't have to happen.
I As I was reading your article, I was preparing actually for today. I came up with a scenario, and I put it as one of the list of things that I sent to you about An NCO observes a soldier showing some sort of heat illness symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
What is the first thing he should do, and at what point does he go back to the rest of his team? I know that was part of it, but there was something at the end. The next question that I had was, what if you have? Then this goes back to that first vignette that you talk about in your article. What if you have a lot of individuals, as they did, and how do you prioritize? The different people. I mean, you might be, say you have 10 people, and 5 of them are not looking good. How do you prioritize those as an NCO?
Yeah, and that's where you rely on your medical personnel, the whole triage process. Is what is triaging? It's really nothing more than an assessment of severity and prioritization of who is in most dire need of our medical attention. So that's where, when you get larger numbers, that's where you really need your medical personnel to step up, get them involved, and that's their role to triage the group, as you will. But I think that to return to your point about recognizing, I do want to make the point to reinforce for the listeners, what are those common signs and symptoms? What are we looking out for, and what should that response look like for that NCO who's overseeing the event, who's moving up and down the line in a vehicle or working alongside people? Most often what we see, especially with heat stroke, but also with heat exhaustion, the medical term is ataxia. It's loss of muscle coordination. When I put it into layman's terms, when I teach classes, I talk about they're walking like a baby deer. We all get that mental picture of kind of stumbling around a little bit. They're trying to walk a straight line, but they can't. Right there, you observe that. That's a red flag. And the first thing that needs to happen is go talk to them. Hey, trooper, how you doing? How you feeling? Oh, ask those open-ended questions. If they struggle to give you answers, if they're not doing well, we might proceed to a quick mental status check. And that's simple questions. Hey, remind me, what's your hometown? What's your mom's name? What was the mascot at your high school? And when I teach using those questions, what I tell them is, it doesn't matter that you don't know what the right answer is. What you're listening for is how quickly and confidently they can respond to that question. Because that tells you a lot about their mentation, their level of mental ability. Because if they can't answer those simple questions, like and all 3 of you right now, if I said, what's your hometown? The answer is popping to mind right away. You can answer that, I'm sure. But if someone struggles to give that, that's a red flag. And that's hey, medic, get someone over there to do a proper evaluation. Stop the person and do a proper evaluation, because you probably have a heat casualty on your hands. Until proven otherwise, if you got that sort of altered mental status during a physical event, it's a possible heat stroke until proven otherwise. And right there, that's the intervention that can really save them from serious further injury.
So you had 3 authors on this. I guess, how did this article form itself? Because we received a very polished copy. So I just want to know how it got to that stage.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Take pride in sending something up that's in really good shape when you first see it there. So I think I mentioned this earlier in our conversation that Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, she gets full credit for the idea for the paper, and she and I just chatted and strategized. Okay, how do we want to approach this paper? And how are we going to divvy up who's going to write what portions? And we took a team approach where, because they were the individuals, especially Major Martinez, our 3rd author, where he was actually part of the commander's inquiry group that looked into that first mass casualty event that happened in June of last year. So he was really able to bring in those details because he was privy to that whole information gathering process. Whereas I'm the heat stress physiologist, I can write the background stuff. So we took a team approach, but then Colonel Thompson and I basically took turns, passed it back and forth a couple times to polish it up. You know, she took my input, she took Major Martinez's input, put it all into one coherent article, and then sends it to me. And I made some revisions and sent it back to her. And okay, are we happy with it? Yeah, and we go ahead and send it up. So it was definitely a collaborative process that we each had an opportunity to contribute to our portions, but then one individual kind of has the lead to make sure it reads and flows kind of seamlessly.
Have you always been a writer, or is it something you've had to learn how to do? And I get answers
Oh
all over the
boy.
board, which I love.
Yeah. I'm still learning how to be a writer. I feel like
Great
that some
answer.
days. You're never done. I learned a very valuable lesson when I was enlisted. I worked at one of the Army's medical research and material command laboratories. And I had an opportunity. I got to know one of the senior scientists there. And he passed on a lesson he learned when he was a doctoral student. I'm not kidding you, decades ago. He's been retired for 20 years. So this tells you how long ago this was when he was a student. And he told a story where his doctoral advisor as an undergraduate himself was a journalism major. And an important lesson both as a writer and as an editor or as a collaborator with others. There's a difference between editing an article and just putting it in your own style. And there's a difference between that and making it better. You have a writing style. I have a writing style. Colonel Thompson, who was our lead author on this, has a writing style. Doesn't mean that one is necessarily better than the other in terms of clearly and concisely communicating what you want the reader to know. And I've got a fair number of publications. This is what I do for a living. I write and publish. As a scientist, that's our bread and butter. Our work is meaningless if we're not disseminating it to whether it's through something like the NCO journal or a scientific journal. Always working to be better at at writing and as a writer. And I keep that lesson in mind that colleague had shared with me, that just because I'm changing how a paragraph sounds doesn't mean I've necessarily made it better. I just made it sound like how I would write it. And that's a difference there. And the sooner you can recognize that, the sooner you can become a better co-author. You know, I also do this as a reviewer because I serve on the editorial board of a couple of different journals. But even just as a collaborator or working with co-authors, that am I making it better or am I making it sound like I wrote that paragraph? And understanding that difference is an important lesson.
Speaking of lessons, what kind of advice do you have for both junior NCOs at the more junior level, like sergeants and staff sergeants, and also for more senior NCOs like sergeants major, master sergeants, sergeants major? What kind of advice do you have for these NCOs when it comes to the kind of things you talked about in your article?
Yeah, when it comes, that's a great question. And boy, my enlisted career ended at E5, so I I don't know how to talk about to the senior NCOs. I don't have the background there. But I mentioned this earlier. Knowing your soldiers, knowing them goes a long way towards understanding in the moment. Hey, are they somehow altered or impaired in a way that might need medical attention? That's an important thing. That the better you know them, the better you're going to have a chance of recognizing that. But also knowing them in terms of, when I came back to that motivation stuff, of knowing who to pull aside. Of, hey, listen, privates, specialist Snuffy, or you're always a hard charger out in front. Weather conditions are kind of crappy today. You might want to, pull them aside, and a little bit of words of wisdom of appropriately pacing themselves because it's rough out. It's hot and it's humid, or whatever the case may be. For the senior NCOs, the importance of planning across especially a larger event like this, we're coming back to, we're talking about EIB testing on the 12-mile foot march. Coordination and planning, it can be across multiple units because a given brigade may be conducting this event, but they're going to be drawing in support assets from outside the brigade. In an instance like this, there's going to be medical evacuation planning and communicating with the local MEDAC, the local MTF, where the senior NCO can be taking a role there in ensuring that those things happen and delegating to the more junior NCOs and whatnot to make sure that coordination happens.
On a separate note, sir, I was giving Tony a hard time because when we were talking about his experiences, the fact that he was a heat casualty, one of the things that I heard back then is about the silver bullet. And I asked him if he got the silver bullet, and he very unashamedly said yes. So that I don't know if the silver bullet is something that anyway, just one of those things we talked about that was a big deal back in the Marine Corps back in the day.
Yeah, so I do want to make a point about that since he did bring it up and we haven't mentioned it yet. When it comes to actually doing a medical assessment of a heat casualty, it is important to know their core temperature. And that's why we need medical personnel, because you'll get inaccurate readings from an oral thermometer or the ear or the armpit. Here at Fort Benning, it's actually local policy. The only authorized method to assess core temperature is a rectal temperature. Only medical personnel are authorized to get a rectal temperature. All the others can be misleading by multiple degrees. They can be off, oftentimes too low, giving a false sense of security of, oh, actually, they're not that hot, when really they are very hot. For better or for worse, our medical personnel are used to getting those, and they'll do it in such a way to maintain some level of dignity and privacy. Do it in the back of an FLA, or it's not out. There's not a crowd, is what I'm saying here. There's a right way and a wrong way to go about doing that in a way that maintains the individual's privacy and some level of dignity. But that's a necessary way to assess a suspected heat casualty in their core temperature. So we really do. I'm glad to hear, where he talked about, that's what that was done, that there shouldn't be any stigma associated with that. It's a thermometer. We're measuring your temperature. So what?
Yeah, I'm glad I brought it up because there's so many things when you're at that level, at that point where an individual is a casualty. I think maybe pride and things like that need to go out the window. You need to focus on your health and being safe.
And you know what? Oftentimes, if it's a true heat stroke with alternate mental status, they may not even realize it or remember it. I spoke with a young lady a couple weeks ago who was a heat stroke, and it was actually a pretty funny conversation. It was in the hospital the day after her heat stroke, and she chuckled about it. She's like, "Yeah, it was during a timed 5-mile run, and she collapsed right around the finish line." And she jokingly said, "Yeah, the first thing I remember waking up is I was in the back of the ambulance naked and I had a rectal probe in my butt." But that's medical personnel doing the right thing, getting them stripped down out of clothing, getting ice sheets on bare skin to get them cooled off, and getting a rectal thermometer in place so they can get their core temperature and track how hot they are when they're cooling off. And doing it in a way to preserve the individual's dignity and privacy. That's what our medical personnel, they're good at that stuff, and let them do their jobs. And let's not worry about those things. That, oh my God, we're going to be, I tell drill sergeants, strip them down to their underwear. Getting them cooled off is a life-saving intervention. We're not terribly concerned about sharp complaints when someone's unconscious and you're doing a potentially life-saving intervention.
That leads to one of the things the one thing that stuck in my mind more than anything was then on that first vignette where the tubs were too low and the soldiers wouldn't get down to dip their arms and because they don't want to have to stand up again and that kind of that is the one point that really stuck to me, and I'm hoping that if anything, if soldiers, NCOs get nothing else out of it, that'll stick in their mind, because that's such a significant, that minor little detail could have
Yeah.
saved so much, could have solved so many problems.
Yeah, it's a really good point. We know arm immersion cooling works for preventing heat casualties, but if we set it up in such a way that there's a perceived barrier to the ease of use, and just simply sending it lower to the ground where the individual has to take a knee, and if you're 9 miles into a ruck and you've got 35 pounds on your back, you're like, ah, crap, I got to kneel down and get back up. That little extra bit of exertion doesn't feel like it's worth it, so you just skip it.
Dip a helmet in the ice and water, and
and instead they dip their helmet in there, and then the water runs out, which was the problem. Is enough people did that, then there wasn't water in it for whoever came after them. How had they have gone differently if those had been set up at a height that was easier just from standing to utilize it for cooling purposes? How might have things been different that day? We can't say for sure, but it sure sounds like it would have been, ease of use is something that needs to be considered when you're planning.
I think ease of use, and also teaching them or giving them a class on the importance of why it is that what they need to do, rather than dip those helmets and put the ice water on their heads, but also giving them the information so they know what they're supposed to do and what the significance is behind it.
Exactly. That's where the education and training of the participants in an event comes into play. That, hey, this is what's going to be out there and it's available for you. This is how you should use it and why. Because it's a tool that we know works to reduce heat casualties, but only if it's used right. And it's not used right if the people who need to use it aren't aware.
Well, on that note, thanks again for joining us. I hope that this was a good experience for you.
Yeah. No, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure chatting with you, gentlemen.
And thank you to our audience. Remember to put your knowledge to the page, submit articles, and get published with the NCO Journal. Don't forget to check out our webpage and follow us on social media. We'll catch you next time on the NCO Journal Podcast.